how do we measure that we're getting close to the goals that they have defined, to the aspirations that they have, and the change that they want to see in their own ecosystem.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show about regenerative finance. We are exploring pathways to a life-affirming economy. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and today's guest is LauNaMu. She is the founder of Metrics Garden. Welcome, Lau.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here, Matthew.
And so we'd love to start with your background and context, maybe pre-crypto, pre-Web3. What was some of the work you were doing?
Oof. Well, I have a background in political science and international relations. So right after I finished college, I joined the Canadian government. I was working for the Canada Fund in Mexico, where I'm originally from. And I was focused on stewarding their grants program and was actively working with NGOs on the ground in Mexico, supporting them through the process of applying to a grants programs, and then through that, accompanying them as they were executing on the projects that they had applied with, and supporting them and understand and showcase what is the impact that they were having, what were some of both the outputs that they were generating, and then the outcomes in the long term that we could observe, and guiding them through the process as well on how to graduate from receiving grants from our own smaller grants program into other more established international aid programs.
Got it.
Yeah.
They've been in this kind of grant-making, outcome measurement, impact space before Web3 as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's actually where most of, well, obviously before Web3, where my experience in terms of being very mindful of grantees and what their expectations are, what their knowledge is when they're approaching these grant programs, and also what the goals that they have and the care that is needed to actually support them in achieving their goals. Instead of one of the things that I observed as well is how easy it was for these international aid programs to really shape what people were doing on the ground,
Right.
just so that they could get funds,
Right.
which meant that some of them completely diluted or lost the real reasons why they were pursuing some of the projects that they were doing. So when I came into the Web3 space, this was also one of the things that I really had at the top of my head. It's like, okay, yes, we want to ensure that grantees are accountable. We want to make sure that we're not wasting resources, which was also one of the learnings that I had from my time in the Web2 space and grants. But doing that while ensuring that we were not damaging or disrupting in a negative way what grantees wanted to achieve.
I see. So there's a theme around accountability, a theme about not being wasteful with resources, and then, of course, some sort of combination of maybe the power dynamics or the consequence of the funders kind of dictating the movements of the grantees so much so that we lose the plot and the ends justify the means kind of thing.
Yes.
Are there any other key themes, lessons, maybe like misconceptions that people have on the outside about grant programs that you saw from those earlier experiences?
Yes. Another thing that I think is really relevant is how, depending on the type of organizations that are applying, like depending on how seasoned they are or like how established they are, oftentimes their focus is not getting funds, right? Like one of the things that I observed a lot with these NGOs that I was working with is their main priority was to do the job. Their focus, several of the NGOs that I worked with focused on reducing domestic violence. And And their main focus was, how do I support women? How do I ensure that they are safe? How do I get them what they need? Rather than how do I showcase what's the work that I'm doing? How do I ensure that I'm complying with specific KPIs that the grants program is asking me for in order to release the next batch of funding, or so that I can check mark that, oh, I've completed this milestone. And so when I observed that, I realized, and sort of like time passed, I came into the Web3 space, I realized that this is actually a very similar thing for a large group of the grantees in this space, in which their main focus is doing the thing. And I think particularly in the Web3 space, there's this unfortunate situation in which um, it has been very normalized that people, when they're starting in the space, are doing free work. Sort of like, oh, you don't need to, along with this narrative of you just jump in, you don't need to ask for permission, just start doing. There's this normalization of free work, of you just come into the space, you join a DAO, a community, you start doing work for free. And then at some point you'll get rewarded. And through that, people start doing, they are doing what they want to do. They are trying to have the impact that they want to see in the world or in their communities. And so that is what they focus on. They don't focus or prioritize having access to funds and what that requires, which is measuring what they are doing, identifying what are the outputs that they are generating, what are the outcomes that they would like to see in the long term, which creates as well this gap in funding, because they are unable to showcase, and to not only showcase but register as well in a standardized way the work that they are doing, so that they can have access to funds.
Got it. So that first part, it sounds like what I hear is like the projects that are often the best at fundraising are really good at fundraising. The projects that are really good at doing the work are often doing the work. And,
Yes.
It's a difficult job for funders to tease those apart because they're not always the same overlapping Venn diagram, right? And then it sounds like what you said about the Web3 space is just that there's this kind of unique set of conditions, maybe because it's these permissionless protocols and that there's these DAOs and it's open source, and there's kind of a culture of like jump in, do stuff. And then we have like this kind of retroactive funding paradigm that is trying to find its legs. But as a consequence, maybe a bit of a disconnect between people, the impact and the funding, and how are we measuring this, and what are the goals and the aims. And so yeah, it's a bit of chaos and noise that needs some structure and coherence.
Exactly. And I think as well, because a lot of the projects that emerge in the space literally emerge, it's not like people are thinking specifically of, okay, I'm going to put together a team that has all of these skills, and one of the skills within it is someone that is measuring or capturing the work that we're doing, right? In terms of where you allocate your resources.
Right.
You, again, like several of these teams that are more focused on the ground impact, or ensuring that they are doing the work that they want to be doing, they have limited resources. And so it's not the first thing that comes to their minds, like, oh, I'm going to hire someone specifically that knows how to do this work, or that knows how to fundraise.
Right. So, all of these things obviously are informing the work at Metrics Garden, but maybe curious for the story of like what led you to the Web3 space, like what piqued your interest, how did you get started?
Yeah. So after working in the grant space, I moved into public policy. I worked in that for some time, precisely measuring what governments were doing to understand how they could become more efficient. Through that, I became very familiar with the concept of microfinance. And in my eyes, like the reason why I started international relations was I want to change the world. And by initially, my idea was by working with governments, this is what I'm going to be able to do when I was a public policy consultant.
Mm-hmm.
And I, through that process, a lot of the engagements that I was in for the consulting firm that I was working in was with migrant workers, both in the US, then in Singapore. And that made microfinance be much more interesting to me. I was like, oh, of course, you have all of these workers moving from one place to another to have access to resources. And that led me to fintech, which was the industry that I moved into afterwards. And I started working in microlending to ensure that we could provide people with access to funding.
Right.
While I was working that, I came across the DeFi space. Uh, and one of the main barriers that I identified while working in fintech was regulatory constraints for launching different financial products.
Mm.
And in my head, it was like, oh, DeFi is the future of financial access and financial inclusion.
Mm.
And so that led me into the Web3 space to identify how can we use this technology to really enable human flourishing.
Mm. Right. Yeah, it's amazing that we haven't fully unlocked it, but obviously
Yes. No.
banking people that are unbanked, giving access to financial services to, to so many in the world that are disadvantaged by the current economic systems, structures, and, the way that everything from cross-border remittances to, microfinance, microlending, like crypto has incredible promise here.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And sort of like, just as you mentioned, I still feel we're pretty far. There's been some good advancements done more recently. But I do think we're still missing a lot in terms of improving the user experience so that
Totally.
we can have adoption. But this is also the reason why I decided to stay in the space. It's like there's this promise, but we need to intentionally work on it, mainly also to ensure that this technology is not only going to be solving for the problems of the global north, but if we want the technology to be shaped to solve for problems in emerging markets in the global south, or what we're calling it now, the global majority, we need people from those trenches that have seen what the barriers are, that have experienced in other industries what were some of the main blockers, so that they can inform how the technology should be shaping up.
Yeah. I feel optimistic that we're going to get there sooner than later because transaction fees, on Ethereum, for example, have gone down almost 100x in the last couple of years. Like the scalability of these systems is finally, hitting prime time, and a lot of the regulatory blockers around stablecoins are starting to become, the policies are becoming clearer, and so we can start to do remittances and cross-border payments and different exchanges to people that then only have to pay small portion transaction fees, which will completely disrupt the Western unions and the current fee structure of the banks, whilst also being something that can happen more easily globally, using the fiat currency equivalents that we were used to.
Yeah, and I think just as you mentioned as well, now that there's more clarity in terms of regulation, like we are starting to see solid regulatory frameworks in different areas in the globe, that also opens up the opportunity for crypto companies to partner up with traditional Web2 finance companies. Right now, finance companies are able to tell, well, this is no longer an absolute gray area or a black box that I don't even know how to relate to, or that the regulator has explicitly said I shouldn't interact with, which opens up so many opportunities in terms of on ramps and off ramps, which, in my opinion, is one of the main hurdles
Right.
for adoption.
Right.
So I do hope that by having this clarity around the regulatory context, we're going to see more Web2 companies enabling these solutions
Hmm.
so that we can have an easier influx of new participants into the Web3 space that are in it not only because it's interesting or it's enabling just new technological opportunities, but really out of a concrete need for specific use cases.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. And of course, when you say on ramps and off ramps, you're referring to moving your fiat currency into the crypto wallets, currencies, contexts, and then back out. Yeah, it's a theme that I really saw here at DevCon, where we're recording this. I heard about it in some of the conversations around Ethereum Foundation, heard about it in some of the conversations around Cello. There's a lot more focus on, yeah, these real world use cases really being this access to financial services for people who've been currently disadvantaged out of the existing system. Obviously, this is something that kind of everyone can agree on is important and meaningful. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting. I wasn't connecting it as much, but I think you're exactly right. This will help lead the next wave of people interested in the technologies, because once they see it making that kind of on the ground impact, they're going to get excited about it.
Yeah. And I think there's also this very important piece of the adoption curve in which right now we're at this phase in which the technology is the most relevant thing, right? It's like, oh,
Mm,
knowing
right.
how Ethereum works. But to really get to adoption, that should be irrelevant. People
Mm,
shouldn't even be aware that they are leveraging blockchain in the backend
right.
to achieve their goals.
Right.
Like if my goal is to send money from one country to another, I still to sometimes I no longer think that, oh, I'm using Swift when I'm asking my bank to
Mm,
transfer funds to this other place. It's usually like, oh, I just want to do an international transfer. And I don't know how Swift works. I only know that most people only know that it's expensive, but it's like, oh, not everyone is familiar with the fact that, oh, Swift is expensive because it travels from banks to banks and then each
mm,
bank charges some X, Y, and Z. Like
mhm,
those are technicalities that are kept to people working in the finance industry.
mhm,
And we should, I think, as a industry, Web3 should push for those type of experiences where you
mm,
don't need to know which chain you're transacting in. You don't need to even know that you're using blockchain in the rails. You're
mhm,
just being able to complete the job that you wanted to do, which
mhm,
is if you wanted to transfer funds from one country to another, you're able to do it. You're able to benefit from it being very cheap, but you shouldn't have to consider what is the overhead of, oh, understanding the technology behind it. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen, particularly in this DEFCON, being pushed for.
mm,
I think for the last couple of years, we had focused on the infrastructure. Oh, all of the things that we needed in terms of infrastructure to scale the network, to allow for more use cases. Now we're past the point, like we've reached a mature enough point in terms of infrastructure where we can focus on use cases. How do
mhm,
we make the user experience a lot more accessible so that we're able to finally onboard and get to adoption?
mhm. It's slight tangent, but it's funny to me that we've like got all these colorful cultural elements inside of crypto with dog coins and memes and like all the speculative activity. But at the end of the day, what we're saying is like we should hide all the blockchain stuff. It should be basically invisible. It's deep infrastructure, really boring, and it's like such an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah. Yes. And I think it's also because the first, I don't know if it's like wave. or a couple of waves of people joining the space. Of course, the pride lies in the technology and the how the technology works, right? And so one of the really big focuses for this first almost decade, a little bit
Yeah.
less than a decade, has been on how do we continue to push in innovating this technology. How do we continue to improve it? But I think also, or like what I've observed as well, is there's different groups of people in the industry. You have some that are focused only on the research side of the technology, and their main goal is to continue pushing for innovating, out of this being an interesting puzzle to continue to hack on. And as more people have flown into the space, you see people that are interested on developing use cases, on providing tools for people that are hacking to continue hacking, but also for people to build these applications that are going to get us to adoption. And so it makes a lot of sense that at the beginning of the development of this industry, the focus was on this technology is amazing and we need everyone to know of the technology and how the technology works. But as we continue to mature, just as with all other tech fields, it's like you don't need to know what's the encryption method that your mail service uses. You're just using Gmail and you're just able to send your message from one Gmail account to a different mail provider, but you don't know any of the encryption services that go in the backend or any of the um, communication standards that are being used.
Right. Okay, so Metrics Garden, like, tell us more about this project and the underlying theses and problems you seek to address.
Yes. I got started thinking about a lot, thinking a lot about impact assessment in the Web3 space early last year. I attended this event called Suzalu, and one of the topics that we had during one of the first weeks was public goods. And at the time, I was still somewhat fresh into the space. I had been in the Web3 space full time for about a year. And I wasn't familiar with public goods. So one of the things that caught my attention was in one of these presentations, they were talking about impact and how to quantify it so that it could be rewarded. And I remember very clearly, like, one of the closing phrases that they brought up was impact assessment is really complicated. And for me, it was shocking because I was coming from the Web2 space, working in grants over 7 years ago. And I was like, but we've been working at completing impact assessment and studying how to do that for over 30 years in the Web2 space. This is not new. The fact that impact assessment requires resources, that it's resource intensive, that it's not, it cannot be fully standardized across different areas was kind of obvious to me. So I was like, oh, wait, what's happening here? Like, why are we kind of like having this conversation again? And this is when I started diving into, okay, what's the state of impact assessment in the Web3 space? Understanding as well the differences, of course. And I think one of the main mappings that when I started focusing on exploring what does the impact assessment space in Web3 look like, was this big disconnect between the refi communities that had an existing basic notion of impact assessment as done by the scientific communities or carbon credits versus the open source software space, which is at least in the Web3 space, it wasn't there yet in terms of understanding what are the outcomes that we want to measure, and then
Mm-hmm.
how do we evaluate and assess the impact that these projects are having.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started working more into that, into understanding, okay, what is considered impactful in the Ethereum ecosystem? How can we understand what are the North Star goals that we have, and therefore, sort of like, what would be the theory of change
Mm-hmm.
that we're trying to derive outcomes from?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I started chatting with different protocols, particularly with Optimism, who is one of the largest funders in terms of public goods, who has this meta of impact equals profit. So through one of their grants programs, they're trying to reward impactful contributions. And what is needed there then is impact assessment. Because otherwise, it's impossible to be able to say this deserves more funding, this contribution deserves more funding than this other contribution.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started just pulling at the threads of why do we have this disconnect between work that has already been done in the impact space in Web 2 and Web 3? Second, sort of like reframing the conversation of impact from, I think, the first time that I first times that I started talking about impact assessment in Web 3, most people thought that I was talking about refi projects, regenerative projects on the ground, because that's the framework that we had to think of impact. And how I like to rephrase it is Ethereum is this ecosystem as well. Like Ethereum is this forest of its own. So we also need to have impact assessment so that we can continue to nurture this open source ecosystem that we have that is enabling us to do all of these different things.
Mm-hmm. So the Optimism Grants Program, can you share more about, that kind of, for people who aren't familiar, the scope of that program?
Yes, absolutely. So Optimism has in its mission to scale Ethereum. And one of the most important pieces there is to enable for open source software to be sustainable. Like it needs to endure and perdure so that it's not captured by third parties. This means that there needs to be funding that is allocated to the continuous development of this work so that it's guided more through a vision of enabling this to be open source for everyone forever rather than be captured and then privatized through other means. And what they've developed to do that is, or they started applying this mechanism called retroactive funding,
Mm-hmm.
through which what they are looking at is evaluating past contributions based on the impact that they've generated to the ecosystem and reward that impact that has been generated. This sits at a opposite direction, so to say, from proactive grants,
Mm-hmm.
which is the type of grants that we've seen most we've seen the most of in the Web3 space, in which funding is given to teams that are making a proposal, in which you don't have a lot of information to be able to assess if the team is going to be able to complete that task, but also if the task is still going to be relevant. Like we are in a space that changes very fast, a lot in terms of its needs, its requirements, both at a technical level, at a human level. And so proactive grants at times can come short. And through this retroactive funding model, what they are looking to do is also be more efficient with resources. Let's look back. It's a lot easier to determine what was useful if you're
Mm.
looking backwards rather than trying to predict the future.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is how they are leveraging this mechanism to incentivize the generation of open source software and to ensure that the funding is going to the things that have been most impactful and not only to the work that has been completed.
Mm-hmm. And then how is Metrics Garden then playing a role in terms of supporting that evaluations, impact assessment?
Yes. So when I was going down this rabbit hole of impact in the Web3 space, I came across Richard PGF and this axiom of impact equals profit. And so my first question was, well, what is impact for optimism? How do they define impact?
Mm-hmm.
And through conversations, I started collaborating with them in creating an impact evaluation framework. So the first task there for Metrics Garden was to understand what is impact within the different categories that they are looking to fund. What are they trying to achieve? What are the type of incentives that they want to generate in the people that are applying to the program and that are part of the community? And then next up is, how do we measure that? How do we measure that we're getting close to the goals that they have defined, to the aspirations that they have, and the change that they want to see in their own ecosystem?
Mm-hmm.
And what's the data that we can leverage to measure that? Is it on-chain data that we're looking at? Is it GitHub data for developers and contributors? Is it also on-chain data, but for educational content, for communications, and then for some of the more fussy categories, such as onboarding or education, what is the type of data that we can generate? How can we support these projects to, again, sort of like showcase what is their impact and what have been both the outputs and the outcomes that they have had in their communities so that they can be rewarded for that work. So Metrics Garden started working really close on this first engagement with Optimism to identify how do we map this the impact is what the impact assessment process could look like for this retroactive round. We published the framework and a database, which was the initial version of Metrics Garden. Metrics Garden was meant to be a database that contains all sorts of potential metrics that could be leveraged by projects to showcase and measure what is the impact that they are having in the ecosystem. It was like this database that encompassed what the metric was, how it was measured, why it was measured that way, through which tools it could be measured, and then allow for projects to leverage that when applying to the retro rounds.
Got it. And so is the vision that this will now be used in other ecosystems and their grants programs?
Yes, that is one of the goals. It has already been used and adapted, which is one of the things that we're really happy about. It has already been used and adapted by some other communities, like the Climate Solutions community that drives one of the largest Gitcoin rounds. We've also seen another of the ecosystems that has also used it is the Filecoin ecosystem when launching their own retroactive round. And so this is sort of as well like one of the public goods that we've put out there. And Metrics Garden's goal is to continue to explore this space. Like impact assessment is a very broad topic that requires a lot of research. It's not a one-off solution. Like this is a continuous learning process. And so what Metrics Garden also does is focus on research. Let's understand this problem space better in this particular context of Web3 so that we can identify what's already out there that can be leveraged to conduct the impact assessments, what is not there yet, what are tools that need to be created so that we can have more robust assessments with new data? And then how can we share these findings with other communities precisely so that we don't need to reinvent the wheel? Like if we are already creating some basic standards or if we already have some learnings from other grants programs, how can we enable sharing that information among grant operators so that as a whole, as an ecosystem, we're one, creating good practices for everyone, including grantees, but also pushing for a more efficient use of the resources that we're deploying.
Right. So what's your instinct on how this matures and develops, given especially you have this experience of traditional, call it offline world grant programs and Web2 grant programs to now on chain? Like, I guess a skeptical view would be that we had a couple hype cycles in crypto. A lot of wealth got generated. Some of it got dislodged from needing to be earmarked to specific things. And the nature of the open source software means that we've kind of got this, you know, furtherance to our ecosystem's aims. We'll give out some grants once you prove that you've done what that you've created some impact for us. We're going to run some experiments, but then like maybe the money will dry out, right? Like, I guess a different view would be like, this is the beginning of a very large shift in how resource allocation occurs, because we're building into the programmable tokens and money systems different ways that capital can be provisioned and allocated into pools, governed into decision-making programs, incentivized and retrospectively and proactively, and with milestone reporting and with delegations and conviction voting and all this, and actually, 5 or 6 ecosystems today, like Filecoin, Protocol Labs, Octant, Optimism, Gitcoin, blanking on the others. Like this is just the beginning, and we're going to see, 50 billion, 100 billion, 500 billion dollars, kind of levels of growth. Those are just, I guess, a couple possible ways to frame it. I'm curious how you would frame where this is going and what the future looks like.
Yes, we're moving towards a more intentional and strategic allocation of funding that aligns with how our industry is maturing, right? At the beginning, when everything was novel and we were creating this magic internet money out of thin air, a lot of the ways in which funding was distributed was not with a clear objective. So we saw so many grants programs that where the intention was literally just to give money away, regardless of whether there was a particular target that wasn't just X amount of money to be distributed, but the specific outcomes weren't there. And I think it was also because our industry was very young, in that it still didn't need to prove itself in terms of being able to generate real money. But as the industry continues to mature and new players are joining that are actually expecting returns on the funds that they're putting in, this translates to protocols being more conscious of how they are spending the funds that they have. They know that they need to show a return on the investments that they're doing through some of these grants programs, which is leading them to question, wait, what happened with all of this funding that I gave out last year, over the last 2 years? Where are the results that I can show for having deployed all of this capital? Which then moves into how can we have programs that are more accountable, that where we are measuring. I wouldn't yet say that we're measuring impact because we're not measuring outcomes yet. We're still very much at a phase in which we're focusing on measuring outputs. We're only looking at how many new developers did I get into my ecosystem and at X point in time, not a long time. Exactly.
Repository
GitHub
commits,
repositories.
gas
It's like
fees.
how many transactions were there in this like first 3 months. And I think we're going to continue to mature to a path of, well, based on growth in Web2 companies as well, we know that it's not sustainable if you need to continuously be paying a really expensive price for acquisition of users. So we're going to start talking more about the stickiness of the users. How can you have sticky users? How can you create products that are enabling more long lasting interactions and relationships between the users and the products?
Mm-hmm.
And this is also going to lead to redefining what the grants programs look like, so that they are no longer only thinking of short term incentives and short term goals, but long term outcomes for these networks. I think several of them are aware that their strategy is to last a really long, like for a really, really long time.
Mm.
And this means that there's not only technical requirements that need to be met, but also in terms of adoption, uh, long-term adoption of this technology.
Mm.
And so we'll see grants programs that are one more accountable, both internally into the companies, but also to the ecosystem. I think we're seeing more peer pressure as well in terms of, well, if you're giving out money without any type of accountability to your grantees, you're damaging the ecosystem as a whole, because you're setting a bad precedent for what grants programs look like and what grantees can expect. So I think we're seeing a rising of the standards of what grants programs should look like, what type of information they should be asking from their grantees, and themselves, what type of information they should be generating to understand if they are being efficient.
Got it. Looking ahead at 2025, what are your key priorities and any challenges, hurdles that you want to mention?
Mhm. Yeah, looking ahead at 2025, one of the main things that we're going to double down at Metrics Garden is the gathering of more qualitative data. So, one of the main products that we launched this year was Impact Garden, which is a platform that enables ecosystems and projects to generate standardized qualitative data and to put it on chain. We noticed that there's existing quantitative data that fortunately has started to be leveraged in the space for impact assessment, but qualitative data is often dismissed because it cannot be verified as easily as quantitative data. And so, what we've been focusing on is enabling through Impact Garden the generation of this standardized qualitative data. We're putting it on chain so that anyone can consume it, and so that anyone can also understand the process through which it was created. And we are looking to see this being leveraged in addition to the quantitative data, so that we're able to get a better picture of what is the impact that these projects are actually having in a particular context. I think a lot of these numbers can easily be taken out of context. In statistics, there's this saying that you can squeeze the numbers and they will talk, right? It's like numbers can't tell any type of story if you don't have the context around how they were generated or for what reason they were created. So by enabling the generation of qualitative data, we want to give more context so that better decisions are made. So we're going to be focusing on that on 2025 and ensuring that we have more distribution models so that people can generate this qualitative data. A key point here for us is the more data that we have, the better decisions we're going to be able to make in the space. So that's one of the things that we're going to be focusing on in 2025, so that we can continue to push at what impact assessment looks like in the Web3 space.
Nice. Well, I'm excited to see how it continues to develop. My sense, especially being here at DevCon, is that these grants programs are on an upward trajectory in terms of scale and importance. And so the impact assessment and the evaluations and the qualitative, not just quantitative ways of thinking about these things. It's you're in a very rich, probably chaotic, but important part of this ecosystem. Any final messages that you'd like to share? And thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the final messages that I would share is funding is very important in the space, and for the space to succeed, and mainly for the projects and initiatives to succeed. But I'm also really looking forward to the next step, or sort of like the evolution of grants programs, in which they are looking past funding and taking into account what are some of the other needs that projects have to be successful, that are usually an afterthought for some of the founders or people that are kickstarting some of these projects. There's more skills that are needed for a project to last, and for funding to be deployed efficiently. This means that we need to support grantees and we need to support projects, not only with funds, but also with the additional expertise or skills that are needed for their products to gain adoption. So really looking forward as well to how grants programs continue to evolve in that direction, so that all this work that we're doing on impact assessment is yielding better rewards.
Nice.
So our website is metricsgarden.xyz. You can also find us in Farcaster and on X. Our handle is metricsgarden, and we're excited to, collaborate with more ecosystems. We're exploring deploying Impact Garden in multiple ecosystems across the Ethereum ecosystem, and collaborating with other grants programs that are looking to define what their goals are and what are some of the frameworks that they can leverage to improve their funding allocation.
Awesome. Lau, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. This was great.
To dive in for more, just go to metricsgarden.xyz. And for other conversations we're having here at DevCon exploring this Web3 grants ecosystem space, just go to maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next one.